Hello and welcome back to Bombshells. I'm Fleur Elizabeth and it's just me this week because we've managed to catch a special guest just before he flies back to America.
Back to America.
It's Curtis Yarvin, formerly known as Mencius Moldbug, the American blogger. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm enjoying London.
Yeah? What brought you here this time?
There was an Unheard event a couple of nights ago, and I was in Paris, and so I was like, let's go to London. I don't know. They're close to each other. They're accessible by horrid discount airlines. I love Europe's horrid discount airlines, and they're just horrid, and the whole European airport experience is somewhat horrid.
You didn't fancy the Eurostar?
It seemed slower and more expensive, but I don't know that that's true if you add up all the transportation and so on and so forth. I'll have to do it at some point, but
I did it last year, and it's just quite pleasant, really.
Mm-hmm.
But I do love how Americans come to a country in Europe and they're like, "Well, I'm in Europe. I'm gonna do all of Europe."
Well, it's so small, I know. It's like
so tiny. Well, last time I saw you was also in London at ARC.
That's right. That's right.
Which was a very interesting.
How did you feel about ARC, Flora? Like, what was your reaction to that?
So I thought that the guests were great, like a great bunch of people, really interesting. Had lots of fun conversations and made connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because they did sort of bring
the people they brought. I think were the best part of the show, and the presentations just in a venue that large were not very intimate and not like it's just hard to make that sort of thing interesting. And then you had this finale with Jordan Peterson. Did you experience the Jordan Peterson finale? That was a real thing to, if I could do, I mean, I love Jordan Peterson to death, really, but if I could do maybe a pantomime for you. Values are the same thing as ideas. Sorry.
That's good. Yeah, it was. I think it was quite funny for me and a lot of my friends because we have political conferences, but that we have like NatCon. When it comes to London, it's in a church hall, and it's very small scale. It's just the same old politicians that we kind of see on the streets anyway, and having this American thing come in and it's like a big show with
it's
lights
transatlantic though.
Yeah,
I mean,
but it was clearly, I mean, in the style it was very American. We had lights and an orchestra and artworks, and just, do you remember the random horns that would come on stage?
The random horns?
Yeah, there was like
I did not spend much time near the stage. The vibe was not,
I do remember you.
It was too American. That's a good way to describe it.
Snoozing on a sofa at one point.
I was definitely snoozing on a sofa, as one does.
Sleepy Curtis.
Yeah.
But yeah, we also had like a funny conversation. I don't know if you remember. We went for dinner one night with a group, and I was talking about pay pigs, and you seemed really like, I guess as a girl online, you're unaware that, or you take it for granted that you have these different people that come to you compared to a man online. And so when I talk about pay pigs with my friends that are female and online, they're like, yeah, I get loads. They've sent me like thousands of pounds. And you were like, are you serious? Like, you don't even have to do anything.
Well, I mean, I don't know how tongue-in-cheek I was, but the the experience of being, even if I'm not a girl, I'm obviously not a girl, but the experience of being sort of a small-time micro e-celeb is like, I mean, ultimately, if I can give a sort of, man-centered idea of the pay pig question, basically, fundamentally, in a way, for someone like me, sort of your Substack dues, which I should probably jack up, are, they're not really the price of the purchase of a product. They're more like party dues. And, the role of party dues historically is very interesting. I mean, we have these things called the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. The Conservative Party actually has a little bit of like sort of structure to it. Like being a member of the Conservative Party is like a serious thing that enables you to vote in some kind of bullshit, some kind of internal election, as I gather. But the thing is, if you sort of go back in time to like real, political parties, which are basically organizations of people functioning as a shadow government, intending to seize absolute power, such as the CPUSA or the NSDAP, or, say, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, you'll find a kind of very different structure. And that's one in which party dues, when you're paying these party dues, they're an expression of loyalty to an organization, to a leader. In the case of the CPUSA, American Communist Society, which was a very elite society in the 1930s, it's where my grandparents were part of this society, was you stop paying your party dues, you lost all your friends.
Yeah.
And that's how our Substacks, I think, should work.
Well, yeah, they definitely do. In for some Substacks anyway, like there's these group of young men who they aren't getting these ideas in this social scene in real life. So when they find it online, they become their friends. They're so loyal.
Yeah. No, there's definitely what we call political parties are operate on very low levels of loyalty and just very low levels of engagement and commitment compared to parties of the past. You said before the show that you wanted to talk about British politics or English politics, and I was I was kind of like, what period? And then I realized that you just meant by default the present. But one of, I think, the most obvious and banal observations that you can make about English politics is that sort of among the three forces of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, the power of democracy has really substantially decreased over the last 500 years. And what I mean by that is that sort of democracy is the power of large numbers of people acting in concert. And 500 years ago in London, what would happen is that, maybe a rumor would go around that the Germans in the steel yard were undercutting true-born Englishmen in the wool trade, and the apprentices of London would get very upset, and they would have a simple solution to this problem, which is basically, let's go kill all the Germans, right? and there's a sort of the institutions that came out of that organized and formalized that force and made it, in some ways a positive and stabilizing force rather than, the terrifying chaos of a Jacquerie, right? Our institutions have a sort of folk memory of that force, which it's entirely lost. And so, I was talking when I was in Paris recently, I was talking obviously to a bunch of French people. They've still got a lot of them there, and you'll see them on the streets, and I raised, the curious case of the Gilets jaunes. You must remember the Gilets jaunes, classically democratic with a small d movement, sort of expressing the power of large numbers of people acting in concert. And they even had this clever idea, which maybe they found somewhere in history, I don't know, of having a bunch of civilians all wear the same clothing as a kind of pseudo-uniform. Brilliant idea. Again, I can't remember where they thought of that. And everything old is new, I guess. And the thing is, all of these Frenchmen, these persons of French, had been taught in all of their school books that France, that precisely the opposite of what I just said was true, that France had gone from, no democracy, under the Bourbons to a lot of democracy now. And, we're almost a pure democracy, just, democracy increases, right? And democracy is all powerful, and demonstrations are part of democracy. And the way, if you're unhappy with the government in France, what you do is you get a bunch of people together in the street, And, it's like the underpants gnomes thing. 1, get a bunch of people in the street. 2, question mark. 3, take power, right? And it's always that question mark that really gets you. And, it turned out that they were basically just LARPing, as we say. And they basically gathered these enormous crowds of French persons in the street, right? And absolutely nothing happened.
Yeah.
And then they were like, okay, well, that was just Act 1.
Well, they just want to skip work.
We'll
right?
come. I think it was on Saturdays.
Okay.
They do want to. I think the Frenchman once worked on. I think maybe in the 19th century there was a Frenchman who worked on a Saturday. But the.
I've just been in France and I could not wait to come home. Like, it's nice, but they just take all of August off. There were no shops open, no supermarkets.
Yeah.
And they would say they'd be open. You'd get there and just be like, how does this country function when you can't even go to a pharmacy?
It is ultimately a land race. But, in any case, they get to like Act 54 before COVID finally shuts them down. And it's just this nonstop kind of LARP. And of course, do you know the phenomenon in psychology called learned helplessness?
Yeah.
So, sort of when you basically have these democratic rituals and they don't produce any results, sort of like if you're familiar with the like cargo cults, like, they're kind of going out and waving the orange paddle and saying we got a lot. And the same for the Tea Party in the U.S. They wave the orange paddles. They expect the planes to land, but no planes land because the war is over, right? And like, you're not storming the Bastille out here, guys. And you're not storming the Bastille out here because you have a mob of 500,000 people, probably many of them are women. Very few of them has ever been in a fist fight, and you look at the mob of Gilets jaunes and you're like, the demonstration, and you're like, wow, I see 500,000 people, and among them, maybe 10 of them have killed a man. Right.
Yeah.
And if that, right. And like, that's not an army. That's just cargo culting. Right. Yeah. And so, when you formalize the power of this in democracy, you shouldn't be surprised that alternate ways of expressing democracy, such as representative democracy, also produce no power and also produce politicians who have little more dream of actually controlling Whitehall, even Brussels, than Charles III has of regaining his throne. And so, obviously his actual throne. And so, like, that's kind of, in a way, that sort of definition of the state of British politics today sort of informs how I see where it is historically. And this is why, the UK Parliament kind of seems a lot like the East German Parliament, to be frank, something that's not actually a thing that's in control of anything. Of course, Herr Starmer has a very DDR kind of vibe about him. Didn't he actually train as a young man in Czechoslovakia?
Yeah.
Yeah, he went to a summer camp in Czechoslovakia. I saw he was working for peace, I imagine. Like,
yeah,
that was probably what was going on there, working for peace. He was
suspicious.
against nuclear war, pretty sure.
Yeah, they have, I'm sure there was, what can I say without risk of being arrested, but I'm sure.
Imagine if Nigel Farage had trained at like an Afrikaner commando, like summer camp.
Yeah, but because he's got this law background, he will very quickly shut down any story like this. Like, there's been many rumours around him, but he's got this ability to just put a lid on it quickly, and then the general public don't know anything suspicious or smell
interesting. Well, nobody really cares anymore. It's like, in 1975, to say Nelson Mandela was a communist was like fighting words, like, and, after he passes, he is revealed to have been, of course, on the Politburo of the SACP, right? But nobody cares anymore, right? And for whatever reason, right? And it's just like, there was a big problem in the U.S. and that's a problem, a little bit of a snafu. Mandela was a sort of radical dorm room kind of dorm room poster kind of figure at the time that, remember Peter Gabriel's Biko, right? Biko, because Biko, right? Very, very inspiring, perhaps before your time, right? But in the 80s in college, when I went to college in the 80s in the U.S., They had like people built like shanty towns on the quad to show how the oppressed, peoples of South Africa were living. And this sort of movement, as movements do, went from U.S. campus quads to the whole world to like the music industry to everyone recognizing Nelson Mandela as a secular saint. And by the time they recognized Nelson Mandela as a secular saint, a sort of, like street naming figure like, Martin Luther King or Kim Jong-un or something, they had this little problem, which was that he was still on the terrorist list because he'd ordered the planting of bombs that killed people in the street, right? And probably for other reasons, but mainly because he ordered the planting of bombs that killed people in the street, right? And so they had to kind of quietly just like be like, we're going to take him off, and it's just a sort of fascinating, all these retcons are interesting. Anyway, you probably have a list of questions and I'm just rambling at you.
No, it's very interesting. We'll do the show and tell quickly.
All right.
Obviously, Curtis is traveling, so
I am traveling.
I
don't bring knickknacks with me. Yeah, no. And this was on very late notice.
Yes,
so,
it was less than 24 hours.
Less than 24 hours.
But you do have something.
I do have something. Well, I could talk about this jacket which I bought at a thrift store in Reno a couple of years ago. But there's only so much that's interesting about Reno or a jacket. So why don't I read a draft of this, not very good poem that I wrote on the way here.
On the way here, as in?
Getting from Kensington to here.
Oh wow!
So yeah, so it's really rough. It's really rough. Do you want a really rough poem here?
I'd love one.
All right. This is called Letter to London. The Georgian wedding cake of Kensington, the square Pall Mall block and fluted Minster arch, stares down the day, silent stone to say, mute in mineral mind. Tents on Park Lane and a Hard Rock cafe. These rocks have seen a lot. The Shard is actually cool in a Brit-pop way. Cool as the grave, and I am homosexual, not gay. Oh, vile conjugation, half Latin and half Greek. Dark chatter in the street. Garments strange and gods. Some Moranti's tongue, mated with the king, new lingua rustica of the late. Is it late? A brick will stay till something breaks it. Graffiti in Greece. Diesel soot and Banksy. Anti-Cambrian hate. Harmless as lichen, hardly an earthquake. A lot of ruin in a nation. Cut razor sharp. In razor days, the crease of England's block is soft. Moss invades the crack. Time's green drink. Mortar, meat for root. Someday a real rain. But money, the final judge. The pagan paper calf, the city's cynosure. Money, absurd and real. Money still wants to be here. London, still the center of a self-whipped world. The brick still knows the score. I'm not sure how it really has an ending, but...
Hey, I like it.
Oh, thank you.
That's very good.
Why, thank you. The anti-Cambrian hate part we were referring... So we were on the subject of demonstrations, and of course, you have a lot of... In the UK, you have a lot of demonstrations, to basically, like, for example, save the climate, save the earth, save the whales, save Nelson Mandela, something like that. It's pretty normal.
There's another Palestine one going on today.
Yeah, there's another save the Palestinians, right? It's all the sense of reaching out, your caring, your love, and projection. You might know the term telescopic philanthropy. Invented by your Mr. Dickens, who wrote so unkindly of America, if you've read his American Notes. It's from Bleak House and the character of Mrs. Jellyby. And Mrs. Jellyby is based on a real incident called the Niger expedition, which was one of the first instances of real, of kind of the missionary colonialism that basically owns the third world now, like the 8 industrial complex. And of course you had these abolitionists and so forth very, very early, the Wilberforce people, Exeter Hall, et cetera, et cetera. And in the 1840s, I believe, I'm not quite sure of the date, they decided that they would mount this expedition to Africa, to Niger. Let's be careful to pronounce that right, Niger. And it would basically, rather than doing the typical rapacious colonial thing of trading and settling and selling and the sort of bad colonialism, they would do a good colonialism, a missionary colonialism. They would do like an aid colonialism, and they would go to the watershed of the Niger, which was said to be ideal for growing cotton, something that was very much needed. And it's kind of a double whammy because cotton at the time was produced by slaves in the American South, something that was very much regretted by these people, right? And so they would basically civilize the Niger and teach them to grow cotton and, create the, kingdom of Jerusalem and Niger's green and pleasant land, right, as one does, and raised many subscriptions from the public for this purpose, et cetera. The whole thing was a disaster. Like, everybody died of tropical disease, like, complete mess, shit show, like, proto-third world activity, right? And Dickens satirizes this in the character of this Mrs. Jellyby, who engages in what he calls telescopic philanthropy, where she neglects her own children, but she is totally about the cause, right? But like her house is slovenly and like totally, substandard by Victorian standards. And, of course, this is almost 200 years old, and there's a real hint of modernity there in Mrs. Jellyby. Have you seen the famous heat map picture, maybe on Twitter? They have the two heat maps of basically like liberals and conservatives, of like, sort of the circle of care or empathy, where liberals care more about things distant from them, like, the earth, the environment, plants, even rocks. And like conservatives care more about things closer to them, like their mother, their children, their friends, right? Someone did an actual study, which, to their credit, basically, sort of revealed this information, and that like I care about, rocks or microscopic fluctuations in the Earth's climate more than I care about my mother or my country even is very English. But of course, that's kind of one strain in politics, these demonstrations that show this tremendous empathy for the Niger, for the Earth, our mother, for, the planet Pluto, something. It's things you can only see with a telescope. And then, tragically, Flora, we saw, and I was observing this with a great concern, the outbreak of these riots. Because you had, I think for the first time in a long time in England, these not peaceful demonstrations. These are not positive experiences. These are deadly riots. And we saw this phenomenon of anti-Cambrian hate, right? Because this Welshman went on this stabbing spree, right?
Welsh.
Well, he's from Cardiff, right? And so, basically, like, rather than see England torn apart by anti-Cambrian hate, right? I think Herr Starmer has acted and has really shown, this has really put the quietus on 500 years of democracy. Because, if in the age of like, Henry VIII or even the 7th, when did Henry VIII take the throne? 15, 20, 30... something you should know this, but I should also know it. And
dropped history.
That's terrible. And from the days when the apprentices would be like, let's kill all the Germans, and like England had no standing army, which was sort of a big, just being an island protected it for so long, but in a way is the cause of all of this rot. Because without a standing army, basically the king can't enforce his will. He can't tax. He can't build a modern state like Louis XIV. He has to have this sort of crumbling, resurgence of this medieval idea of parliament, right? Which had sort of become a cipher really under the Tudors. And, and all of this progress toward modernity, like, results in this kind of cancerous British, like perfidious Albion, the source of anarchy that spreads to France and then the rest of the world and leaves us where we are. Yeah. And if we just imagine the medieval order, but with iPhones, I mean, it would be amazing, right? And there's no reason we can't imagine that. Actually, there's no reason we can't. Well, but in any case, what we see in kind of, the work of the highly efficient British, police, they do these YouTube clips like, we will catch you, like it's intense, man. It's intense from across the Atlantic. That's how intense it is. And you basically realize that, the methods and tactics and powers that the authorities and the technologies that the authorities in, for example, Hong Kong used to basically shut down like the last pantomime, because make no mistake, it is also a pantomime of anti-government democracy, are completely invincible. And so all of your LARPing in this system, which actually assumes, because it was once the case, that if you pissed off a large sector of the population, they would rip the ministers' heads off and throw them in the Thames, right? And democracy is simply not capable of that now. And everyone is playing the game as though it was. Everyone is playing the game as though, that sort of online thing of like the Kipling poem, when the Saxon begins to hate, right? And you show like when the Saxon, their voices were steady and low, and then you have the picture of like the skeleton on the bench waiting for the Saxon to begin to hate with his, his anti-Cambrian hate, right? And his traditional hostility toward the Welshman. Do you know what the word Welsh means in Saxon?
No, I don't know.
It means foreigner.
Oh, right, yeah.
It means foreigner. It means literally a person who can't speak the language, like a mute, which is often the name for foreigner. And so basically, to the Saxons, the Welsh were considered.
Welsh.
What?
He is Welsh.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
and in the deep
now.
sense, that's right. And I want to spread this meme of anti-Cambrian hate, right? And anti-Cambrianism, right? Let's, we should really, if we could get, I won't even say the name of the organization, but if we could get them to focus a little bit more on anti-Cambrianism, I think that, because I think there's a deep vein of prejudice that's still there. It reminds me of, there was this diplomatic incident about 25 years ago that I was not really politically conscious at the time, but I was just reading the newspaper and found it very funny. So our President Clinton, great man, very, very charismatic, is making a speech, and it's in the bold style. It's very sonorous, and he's like, telling people that, America will always honor her obligations, except he doesn't quite phrase it that way. It sort of reminds me of the time my grandmother was talking to my father and mother, my father being, of course, of the Hebraic persuasion, and my grandmother is describing a real estate transaction that she'd engaged in which I think the seller had wanted 180, but she negotiated him down to 165. Unfortunately, negotiated was not the word she used, right? And that caused some friction, right? And so, President Clinton comes out and, in response to something Middle East, Iran-Contras, I don't know, he's like, the United States does not welsh on its obligations. So that creates that's basically a naked display of anti-Cambrianism, right? And it creates this... it creates a certain amount of diplomatic, chatter, right? And the end result of this diplomatic chatter is that the State Department comes out and with a statement which reads something like, I forget, of course, the exact words, is that, of course, the president did not mean to offend the people of Wales. All he meant was to say that the United States of America does not dishonestly and unfairly renege on its obligations. And by the way, Taffy was a Welshman. Taffy was a thief, right? And sorry, I thought we can clip that part, right? And, wouldn't do it to have you accused of anti-Cambrian hate, right?
No.
And
no, I was my dad used to say as a joke when we were children that Welsh people hatch out of nuggets of coal. But
wow.
I was so gullible as a child that until I was about 10, I genuinely thought that was like where the Welsh came from.
These are gems. These are pure gems of anti-Cambrian hate.
Yeah.
We have to unearth them and deal with them like psychologically.
Unearth the Welsh.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. It's like one of those exercises where you go and you unearth your inner racism, right? And yeah. No, I scored a small. It was kind of an L. I said a couple of not quite the right things to the journalist. But there was a hit piece on me from the Information, like Kamala HQ on Twitter actually tweeted a clip from not very good clip from a Charlie Kirk interview at the World the other day, describing me as a MAGA operative, and it's sort of, I don't really like having this kind of spotlight pointed at me. So my response was to, and this is true, by the way, I endorsed President Biden every time he's run for president. I endorse him still. He's been, I believe, in some manner, I don't know how, illegally removed from the ballot. Me and some Silicon Valley friends are working on a write-in campaign. And, I support President Biden and wake up everyone. They're holding him in Delaware like Gorbachev, And I don't know how. I don't exactly know how at Kamala HQ responded to that one. But, I've just started using Twitter a little bit. It's kind of fun. It's like I'm just started using heroin a little bit. It makes me super happy. And, the objective is sort of, but in any case, I was being interviewed by this reporter, and I was not being interviewed. I did not cooperate with this piece because I knew it was a hit piece. And she sends me her fact check thing at the end. Is it true that you X? Is it true that you Y? Is it true that you Z? Et cetera, all these nasty insinuations. She insinuated that I had met my wife before I broke up with my ex, which was not true, et cetera, despite being corrected by me on this, of course. Digs up my family court, files, really nasty stuff. And one of the things she says is, she's like, is it true that you've been, you've propagated scientific racism? And and this was actually only, it's rare to get a W in these situations. The best way to win is not to play. But I was like, I find the term scientific racism, I think that's loaded language. That's emotional language. It has no place in a straight news story. And I prefer the terms human genomics, or if you must, race science. And by the way, here's an example of race science. It's from a magazine. It's from 2020. It's from a magazine called Science. They have a lot of science, and here's this very interesting piece of race science, which you might want to link to. They didn't link to it, but it's Dervassala 2020 if you want to look up the reference. And it's a sort of, and if you read the abstract for Dervassala 2020, it's a very interesting abstract to read, because mentally, when you read every line in that abstract, you can replace the period at the end of every sentence with the phrase, confirming the remarkable early insights of my Uncle Roy. And so in any case, I did not, I was just, honestly, I was just amusing myself, right? And then when the piece comes out, it indeed accuses me of trafficking in race science. And my friends in the human genomics business are, which is of course a very serious science, right? As one would expect, being published in, Science, right? Are like, wow. And then they're like, really, they all love me a week later when this article in The Atlantic comes out. And the article in The Atlantic is all about why are so many prominent people in Silicon Valley basically talking about race science. And, so I'm like, did I meme that one? Could I have memed that one?
Yeah.
And, obviously, I think the definitive studies have yet to be done on what race science tells us about the Welsh. But, I can't think of a better time. Perhaps there should be a whole field of studying the Welsh.
Yeah,
why are they like this? Leak genetic. I know, but
eager to hear.
Yeah. Anyway, let's move away from the anti-Cambrian material. You wanted to talk about British politics or English politics, perhaps.
So in your poem, you were talking about the tents on Park Lane, which are it's awful.
It is a mere shadow of what we have in the Bay Area.
Well, this is what I was going to say.
It is a mere shadow.
There's this perception on the American right that Britain It's a totalitarian country.
Britain is the world's most pleasant place to live. Hey,
with-
London, the best parts of
Yeah.
London are the world's most pleasant place to live, which is why all the oligarchs are here.
Yeah, that's true.
Why else would
But
they be, right?
This perception that there's like a huge migration and crime problems when
You haven't seen anything yet.
Kamala?
What?
Kamala? I don't know. I never know. If I'm saying that right.
Kamala, Kamala, that was like a camel. I think she resents being.
Kamala.
Kamala.
She's planning to censor Twitter, and like American cities have no-go areas. So like, why is the American right just like picking on us? Leave us alone.
I saw a remarkable statistic about Americans today. If you poll Americans, 40% of Americans report that they would feel unsafe walking outside their own homes at night. Oh yeah, and we have the best system of government in the world and in history.
And also, so much of America is like quite like rural and.
Yeah. Well, mostly not the rural places. I experience. I'm a little cautious walking. I'm live in one of the better parts of a nice city in the Bay Area. And I went outside at 4 a.m. to take out the trash the other day, and there's it looks quite bucolic, but still at 4 a.m. when taking out the trash, you might hear someone coming down the street talking loudly to himself in some kind of incomprehensible Gula accent, in which the word kill is frequently repeated.
Yeah, it happens outside my office.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, charming, and then you're just like, what would Queen Elizabeth I say about this? I was being, someone at a dinner I had in Paris. This is a test that I love to run past Englishmen and Englishwomen, I guess. I had this guy show up and draw me in Paris, a little charcoal pad or whatever. He was a Welshman, actually, a person of Welsh, and he didn't seem maybe quite as based as some of the other guests. And so I asked him my favorite stock question about England, which I think every Englishman and Englishwoman should ask themselves, which is, what would Elizabeth I have thought of Elizabeth II? And as it turned out, this chap, had actually himself, whose name was literally like Llewellyn or something, they have these unpronounceable consonants that actually, were genetically incapable of forming the sounds of Welsh. If you raise a human or an English baby in a Welsh, they will not actually properly speak Welsh because the shape of the palate.
If you raise a human, they can't speak Welsh.
And, sorry, we're getting back into the anti-Cambrian hate, but in any case, I should say something good about Lord George, but great man, Lord George. Ministry of Munitions, amazing job. In any case, where was I? I lost my thread.
Elizabeth I.
Elizabeth I. What would Elizabeth I think of Elizabeth II? And, this chap was who had actually drawn Elizabeth II, as it turned out. Maybe perhaps he was a distinguished artist, although his picture of me looked very dark. I'm not that dark person. I'm actually very, very, once you get past the black pills, I'm actually very happy, although not at all optimistic, and he was like, well, I think she would think she was wonderful. And I was like, okay. I'm like, let's go to the tape, right? And it's you don't have to look too hard to be like, okay, well, for starters, you gave away all of your power and were a complete fake. Elizabeth I was actually very jealous of her power. She was kind of pissed off when this whole Mary Queen of Scots thing was pulled, where she signed the death warrant and didn't really think it was a death order. I guess you dropped history, but you might remember that.
I
one.
do know about this.
I
guess I know what happened, just to know when.
It's fine. It's an impressionistic picture. The story is right. The details, they matter much less, right? But, and I guess you could say, I'm supposed to meet with a well-known British historian who used to be on the BBC until he said some incautious things. And I'm trying to kind of set up a kind of debate with him in which maybe he'll be for constitutional monarchy and I'll be for absolute monarchy. And so we'll see if we disagree on the subject. My view is that constitutional monarchy will always turn into ceremonial monarchy like this, right? And when you look at, the Tudor period where Henry VII is the boss, Like he conquers England like with a sword. He's actually like fighting with his sword as he conquers England, right? He's absolutely and totally the boss. And Henry VIII also absolutely and totally the boss. Like there's Parliament. Parliament still exists in the Tudor period, but and I'm sure a real Tudor historian would express this in a more nuanced way. But when I look at the Tudor Parliament, it seems to be sort of like the Chinese Parliament. As you may know, China has a parliament, like the National People's Congress, right? It's just this sort of weird relic of ceremonial relic. Mm-hmm. And the ceremonial relic, which is a gathering of the aristocracy, which used to exist when the aristocracy are like the barons and so forth, acquires new power as sort of this with this rising gentry class. Many of them, all forgive me for saying the word, are Puritans, and they cause a lot of problems. Actually, did you know most English people don't know about the anti-Americanism in Shakespeare?
I didn't know that most English people didn't know that.
So there's this the line about Brownism. So there's a line in I think it's Twelfth Night where someone is like, I would as lief be a politician as a Brownist. First of all, there's nothing democratic in Shakespeare. Shakespeare is has a very profoundly reactionary cast of mind, but when he says Brownist, what he means is one of the sects that, in the late 16th century were sometimes called independents. And he means exactly the people who were basically driven out of England because everyone found them completely obnoxious, and thence to Holland, where everyone found them completely obnoxious, and then across the Atlantic to North America when no one could stomach them anymore, where they were obnoxious to at least each other, right? And and this is sort of the root of the modern world in a way, because America, and specifically, there's always been this tie between the Puritans and their brethren back home, and that alliance has sort of remained despite various conflicts of the American and British shitlibs, as we sometimes say, and that's sort of what created the modern world. And so to find Shakespeare condemning it is kind of cool. But yeah, actually, I feel that the sort of the decay of the English monarchy in a way starts with Elizabeth, because she lets her people, she lets her bureaucrats, she sort of, the deep state gets going there. The history of English intelligence basically starts with like Walsingham. The history of sort of the English state, starts with the Cecils. And, she kind of takes her eye off the ball a little bit. And when, for example, her people like cut off her cousin's head without her permission, she's not like, okay, well, you guys have heads too. She's like, did you really have to? And then, James the First comes in, who is, of course, Mary's son. And he's a king with no domestic power base, probably spoke with an absolutely atrocious accent, and his main goal is to like stay king. And like because he's not afraid of like popular revolts, he's afraid of like shit like the Essex revolt, right? But his main goal is to stay king, and so he lets sort of more and more power slip away from him. And and it's notable in English history that you see James the First writing all this stuff about divine right monarchy. All this, he's writing himself, right? He's actually literate. He's read books, right? Speaks Latin, right? Whereas, Herr Starmer speaks only like English and Czech, I guess, And and I don't know that for a fact. Whether he speaks Czech or not, or other languages, I'm really not sure.
Apparently very difficult.
It's probably very difficult. Czech is a very hard language, right?
Well, I studied Russian, and they said,
oh my gosh,
don't bother doing.
You're
Czech
not
working
with the Russians, or there's been some scandals on that.
Me, no.
Okay, good.
You could do Czech as an extra module, but all of the people older than me were like, don't do it. It's way harder than Russian.
That's amazing.
And Russian is
hard.
Awful.
It's not like French. It's a totally different language. It's almost a different
German's
species.
my favourite, then French. I hate Russian.
I only know programming languages. And so
Welsh next.
Welsh next. Oh my God, Quillen, and so you start to see James is like talking a lot about how he has absolute power because he feels it threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also this strain that starts to creep in early 17th century history of what we now call lawfare. So if you look at like Blackstone and Cook, who are like all, very like, the rule of law, it's all like celebrated. These guys are weasels, basically. Mm-hmm. They're shysters, and they're basically digging up weird old Saxon stuff, pretending that like Saxon law is relevant, or like Magna Carta. Nobody gives a shit about Magna Carta for centuries, right? And they're coming up with all of these reasons why the most fundamental axiom of basically the English law, which is that the king is above the law, which is like, duh, otherwise, somebody's going to order his head cut off, mm-hmm. right? And Charles I, of course, kind of sees, I think everyone sees the kind of rising power of this gentry class, which is really, they're very virtuous, they're very capable, it's really something to be reckoned with. And, does something a little like sort of the way Louis XVI does with constitutional monarchy, and is like, okay, he kind of becomes a fan of the new kind of system in a way, a little bit. He certainly respects it. He feels, on the scaffold, he apologizes for letting the Parliament pass the attainder against Strafford, right? Mm. And Strafford's, thorough policy of thorough, which was the last sort of, gasp of absolute monarchy in England, like he was a great administrator, like a Colbert type, and from then it starts to decay very, very rapidly. And I think the only period of real, again, just my interpretation, not a specialist, no history degree, but the way I see the story is that the only period of real constitutional monarchy where the king is actually sharing power with the Parliament in a substantive way is basically the reign of Charles II. And after that, and after James II, and James II, of course, mm-hmm. and after James II tries this fascinating experiment of saying, being, of course, a Catholic, mm-hmm. which is crazy at the time, right? He's a very Trumpian figure almost, like, because he just goes against the whole grain mm-hmm. of the aristocracy. And he's like, basically like, here's my idea. We're going to tolerate both Nazis and communists, right? And the, of course, communists are just like absolutely furious at this. The Puritans, the dissenters, would rather be oppressed themselves than see Catholics not oppressed.
Right.
Right. And I mean, Catholic emancipation only happens like the middle of the goddamn 19th century, right?
Yeah.
And
my family came here in 1575, escaping France as Protestants. So.
Yeah. But did they cause trouble after that?
I don't think so.
They
went up to Aberdeen.
Got it. Yeah. But they became like Presbyterians up there. I'm
not sure. They were like governors of a castle.
That's good.
So I think they stayed out of trouble.
Yeah, that sounds like staying out of trouble. But then you get this situation where William is really the king, but he replaces after Queen Anne, and a detail of English history or English politics, which I think I don't know how many educated Englishmen and women know this, is, are you aware that the monarch has the right to veto legislation passed by the Commons?
Yeah.
When was the last time that right was exercised? Which monarch? Take a wild guess.
I don't know, like Victoria?
Anne.
Really?
Anne.
Right.
In like 1706, I think she used her veto, and that was the last time. So the thing is, you basically see all power atrophies if it isn't used. It's like a muscle that you're not using.
Yeah.
When the people are not powerful, the power of democracy atrophies. When the monarch is not powerful, that power also atrophies. When basically Elizabeth I is disrespected by Cecil and Walsingham, and she doesn't like fucking purge them, like she loses power permanently. And if you just let that go on permanently, you have this population, and you go from that to like Brexit, where, you know, the people, you know, sort of pass Brexit, and they have this like, you know, I don't even know what they thought they were doing with Brexit, honestly. I could barely tell, but it's a sort of symbolic gesture, and the idea that the symbolic gesture is going to lead to something real, someplace you're going to go after you exit. But it's like a toddler running away from home. Like, you get out the door, and the door locks behind you, and you're like, but I wanted a peanut butter sandwich, you know? And then you're on the steps, and like, you know, things are a little messy. And if you look at the actual effects of Brexit, of becoming, restoring your independence, Britannia rules the waves again. You know, what are the effects of Britannia rules the waves again? You know, a lot of different kinds of bureaucratic hassle, weird shit in Ireland. Ireland can take it. They've had a lot of weird shit. And what else? I guess more Somalis, less Poles. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, and like, you know, what? Right? You know, where were we going with that? Right? You know, it was this sort of juvenile gesture of complete ineffectiveness. And the thing is, Brexit isn't, you know, and the worst thing about, or the funniest thing about Brexit is that, you know, what you're doing, of course, is not taking power back for the sovereignty, back for the British people. You're like, okay, we're going to take sovereignty back from Brussels, and we're going to give it to Whitehall.
Yeah.
Okay. And the question of whether
people didn't know this.
Why did they not know this? Were they not told? Did anyone know? Had anyone seen Yes Minister? Like, you know, no, they didn't know this, because the thing is, and they didn't know this not just because the left lied to them, Flora, but also because the right lied to them. Yeah. And like, basically, you can't do anything. You and I are not in a position to do anything about the ways in which the left lies. That is between them, their conscience, and God. You know, they, you know, I'm remembering a line from an autumn poem, but I'm gonna, you know, butcher it. You know, they it's like the ogre. You know, do you know the poem, the autumn poem, the ogre? Or let's see what it's called. I should read somebody else's poem. This could apply very well to a lot of very contemporary situations. August 1968. It's about the suppression of the Prague Spring. And Auden, of course, from the lifelong communist, basically, or liberal, whatever, you know. And, you know, this was his final expression of revulsion with the Soviet experiment. August 1968. The ogre does what ogres can. Deeds quite impossible for man. But one prize is beyond his reach. The ogre cannot master speech. About a subjugated plain, among its desperate and slain, the ogre stalks with hands on hips, while drivel gushes from his lips. Yeah.
We're going to have to wrap up.
All right.
I'll just cut this bit out, just because I've got to be somewhere.
All right.
8 minutes ago, but
it was fun.
We're good.
It was good.
Okay.
It was good. Are there any parts you have to cut for fear of Herr Starmer? You know, could you be arraigned for anti-Cambrian hate? You know.
Oh yeah, I'll have to find that out. Although, like, who even knows how to interpret the laws? Okay, right. I'll get into ending it. Well, it's been so great having you on. Super interesting, and glad to catch you before you fly back to America.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. Tomorrow. I mean,
tomorrow.
You know, there's a little bit of apprehension these days in Europe when you stick your passport in the passport gate. You're like, it's kind of one of these moments in life where anything could happen. Mm-hmm. I'm not Pavel Durov. I guess I do kind of run a decentralized network, but I'm not Pavel Durov. And I'm certainly not Tommy Robinson or Milo Yiannopoulos. Mm-hmm. And what would happen to Milo? Would they go after Milo? I don't think they would go after Milo. No, he's too gay. He's too gay. He's too gay.
He's fine.
Next time we have to wrap up. But next time, if there is a next time, I'll tell you about the last time I met. The last time I met Milo in Kanye's office, which was also the office of Dov Charney, notorious for his like pornographic American apparel. Like you know, it was a strange day.
Well, I can't wait to hear about that. So yeah, let me know next time you're back in town.
And we'll do another one. Maybe with your co-host.
Yes, yeah. Unfortunately, she had plans this weekend. But where can... If there's anyone who doesn't already know you, where can they find you?
You can find me on graymirror.substack.com. That's Gray with an A, the American way.
Mm-hmm. There we go. Well, thanks for coming on, and thank you everyone for watching and listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe and give a comment, and see you next time.
And send... Never mind.
Bye!